2, 1.
Welcome to How Did We Get Here educational program, sponsored and presented by the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. I'm Van Voorhees Trivett, president of the High Point Historical Society. How Did We Get Here is an educational experience that takes a current topic, exploring it through the progression of time and how it might tie to High Point and our surrounding community's history. Today's topic, we're going to explore the history of the North Carolina Underground Railroad and the role of our Quaker community. Let's get some ground rules set. First, our speakers will present, and then we will have a question and answer session. If you have a question, please use your Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will compile these questions. Teresa Laughlin will lead the question and answer session. If you don't get your questions answered, we will answer those with an email to you directly. Leading our exploration today is Dr. Adrian Israel and Dr. Max Carter. Dr. Adrian Israel is a retired professor of history and former vice president of academic affairs, academic dean at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. She has published scholarships in both African and African American history. She has taught African and African American history and various interdisciplinary courses at Guilford College and in other venues before she retired in May of 2019. A native of Ohio, Dr. Israel is a graduate of Howard University, where she earned her undergraduate degree in English and a master's degree in African Studies. And she earned her PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Max Carter recently retired as William R. Rogers Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College. He is a member of New Garden Friends Meeting in Greensboro. Dr. Carter has published a book, Tales from the New Garden Friends Graveyard, which contains stories of several of the participants in the anti-slavery activity among Friends during the time of the Underground Railroad in Guilford County. We welcome you both and thank you for leading us on this exploration.
Thank you. Max Carter here, and I'll lead off and then hand the baton on to Adrian. I want to begin with some background of how the Quakers who were involved in the Underground Railroad got to Piedmont, North Carolina, because that is very important in informing their participation. Quakers emerged out of the English Civil War in the mid-1600s and wound up in the American colonies pretty soon thereafter. And in 1688, a number of those Quakers who had fled religious persecution in Europe assembled in Germantown, now a neighborhood of Philadelphia, to register their concern that Quakers owned slaves. Quakers had not rejected slavery in their first decades, and 4 of those refugee Quakers from persecution in Europe felt it odd that Quakers would be involved in such a terrible institution. And in that year, 1688, signed a one-page document called the Germantown Remonstrance. You can Google it, Germantown Remonstrance. And it simply started with the premise that as a Christian body, they ought to embody the Golden Rule. None of them would want to be enslaved, so why would they enslave others? That concern then started filtering through the Quaker organizations, monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, yearly meetings, but met a great deal of resistance by those Quakers who were invested in the economic system of slavery. Quakers in Philadelphia owned slaves at a higher percentage than anyone else because they were the first there under William Penn and had a lot invested in this money-producing, wealth-producing institution of slavery. So it met a great deal of resistance. But by the early 1700s, there were several individual Quakers who took up the mantle of anti-slavery and pushed the envelope. The first I want to mention from there in southeast Pennsylvania was Benjamin Lay, who had been a sailor for 17 years and had witnessed the worst of slavery, the Middle Passage, the plantation culture in the Caribbean. And he engaged in guerrilla theater to try to convince friends to end slavery. His most famous was striding into a Quaker meeting that had rejected the plea to end slavery and holding a hollowed out Bible with a pig's bladder full of red berry juice in it, plunged a sword through it, splattering the blood on the fine Quakers around, and proclaimed that not ending slavery is like taking a sword and plunging it to the very heart of the gospel. Well, he was kicked out. But he kicked open the door for later friends like John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, who did a great deal of travel, ministry, and writing about anti-slavery. In 1757, John Woolman, an ardent anti-slavery activist from Mount Holly, New Jersey, walked to North Carolina to confront Quaker slave owners, especially in Perquimans and Pasquotank counties, where there were large Quaker plantations that enslaved persons, wrote a letter to the New Garden meeting here in Guilford County urging participation in anti-slavery. And in 1772, those entreaties found a welcoming ear in Thomas Newby, who was a plantation owner in Belvedere, Perquimans County. And he said, I need to manumit my enslaved persons. And that finally pushed the yearly meeting, the Organization of Quakers in North Carolina, to become anti-slavery by 1778. So that sets the stage for the migrations of Quakers from southeastern Pennsylvania into the Piedmont. Those were the first Quakers into this county of Guilford. And so they came from an area that had produced the Quaker anti-slavery movement. The Mendenhalls, the Newlands, the Carters, and the other European Quakers who had settled there. So they came with their anti-slavery sentiments. They were followed shortly thereafter, in 1772, by a large influx of Quakers from Nantucket. Nantucket was one of the first communities in America to struggle with an anti-slavery stance. It was made up of those Quaker whalers that are famous in Moby Dick, the Starbucks and the Macy's, the Coffins, the Gardners. And they too, as sailors, had witnessed the worst of slavery. And so they had developed an anti-slavery stance. So Guilford County was populated in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s by anti-slavery Quakers. And when they adopted an anti-slavery testimony in 1778, they were faced with the problem of what to do with those enslaved persons, because it was against the law to manumit or free your enslaved persons. So they found a loophole. Those who manumitted their enslaved persons handed title over to the Organization of Quakers in North Carolina, the North Carolina Yearly Meeting of Friends, which then held title to upwards of 1,000 enslaved persons who were allowed to be free. They were known as Quaker Free Negroes. And if they were kidnapped or they were picked up with the supposition that they had fled slavery, they could show their papers. Of course, the legislature could work around that. Then Friends turned to colonization societies, finding those willing to go back to Africa or to the Caribbean. That didn't work because of easily being re-enslaved and the terrible conditions back there. So by the early 1800s, Friends were engaged in illegal activities, the Underground Railroad. And I want to talk about just 2 or 3 specific instances before I hand it over to Adrian for further information about the Underground Railroad activity here. As a young boy, Levi Coffin, who was born in 1798, a descendant from those Nantucket Quakers, was living on a farm near the New Garden community, Guilford College now, and found as a boy looking for hogs in the woods to feed them, that there were fugitives from slavery hiding out in those New Garden woods. They would dig primitive caves, they would make debris huts, and they would simply find sanctuary in those woods, escaping whatever awful conditions back on the plantation or where they were enslaved. And hearing their stories, he became very committed to an anti-slavery position. Later on, as a young boy, probably around 1810, maybe, he confronted David and Rachel Caldwell, who were about to send one of their enslaved women, Edie, to be domestic help with their oldest son and his new wife down in Charlotte. She didn't want to be separated from her husband and family, so she escaped to the New Garden woods, sought sanctuary there. And after about 2 weeks of being cold, sick, hungry, went to the Coffin home, and Levi heard the story of what had happened to her. And he went and confronted David and Rachel Caldwell, perhaps one of the most important couples in all of North Carolina at the time, and convinced them not to send Edie away. By the mid-1810s, Quakers were involved in manumission societies. Levi Coffin's first cousin, Vestal Coffin, helped establish the first manumission society here in Guilford County. They helped with the kidnapped Benjamin Benson, getting him to use the court system, supporting him in the court system to be freed as a kidnapped free Black. And then in 1819, John Demery, another free Black who had sought sanctuary living in the New Garden community surrounded by Quakers, was kidnapped by the children of the man who had manumitted him. And Vestal Coffin interceded, scared the kidnappers away, and he and John Demery that night in 1819 got together and mapped out the route for Demery to get to Indiana, to Richmond, Indiana, a town established by 3 Quakers from Randolph County, and freedom. 6 weeks by foot, John Demery arrived in Richmond, where he worked for 2 years to earn the money to send for his family to join him in freedom. So 1819, the first known passenger, John Demery, the first known conductor, Vestal Coffin, on what later became known as the Underground Railroad right here in Guilford County. So with that background, I'll hand it off to Adrian.
Oh, Max, I was caught up in your story. It's good storytelling. And I want to pick up by saying that Levi Coffin and his cousin left their memoirs, Addison Coffin. And in those memoirs, both of them talk about how they worked with free Black people in this region and enslaved people who were part of this operation. In fact, they were critical to the operation because, for one thing, the fugitives often disguised themselves as free. And to do that, they used what they called free papers, which were court documents that were issued to free Black people to authenticate their status, whether they were born free or whether they were manumitted by the courts. They had to have these documents, and they had to have them on their person at all times to verify that they were free. And so they used these documents to disguise the fugitives as free people who were traveling with them going north if they were stopped on the road by authorities or slave catchers or patrollers. And so one particular person, Vina Curry, who was mentioned in Coffin's memoirs, she was a washerwoman in New Garden boarding school. And he said that she lent her deceased husband, Arch Curry's free papers to fugitives who were going to Indiana. And Levi Coffin would then get those papers and send them back to New Garden boarding school, back to Vina Curry. And I got interested in that process, wondering who is this Vina Curry? Looked her up and looked her husband up. Well, women were not listed in the census until 1850, unless they were single women who owned property. So therefore, her husband, Arch Curry, or Archibald Curry, was in the census. And apparently he and Vina had moved from Robeson County in southern part of the state into the Piedmont by 1820. And they had bought property from Quakers, lived off Horsepin Creek Road area, which is north of the college. So there was a substantial free Black population, in fact, in Guilford County. It was a small county. Oh, I would say maybe 2,000 people at the beginning, and moved up to maybe 15,000, 20,000, and about 15 to 20% of them were Black, and about 25% of the Black population were free. And they sustained themselves by farming, and they were blacksmiths and so forth. In fact, Guilford County became a kind of a haven for free Black people who moved from Virginia into North Carolina and into the Piedmont in fairly significant numbers. And so their role in this Underground Railroad was critical. And I began to expand my research and discover how these relationships grew and developed over time, so that when Arch Curry died, there were other free Blacks who, two of them married Curry daughters, and they became involved with other friends in this region who continued the Underground Railroad operations into the 1840s, all the way up through the Civil War. Many names pop up and evidence in the ads that I found about fugitive slaves, where the slave owners actually mentioned Newgarden as a likely place the fugitives were headed, where they could get help from friends and from free Blacks. And this happened. It also came up in court cases. Especially there's one interesting one that involved I would say the principal of Newgarden Boarding School, who's not mentioned very often, but he was very significant. That's Joshua Stanley. And Joshua Stanley and his wife, Abigail, who was Nathan Hunt's daughter, both lived on the campus, and they were taken to court, accused of working with Deep River Friends. The network moved from Deep River Friends meeting in High Point to Newgarden, where they worked together, and all the way over, in fact, into Alamance County, to Cane Creek. I believe that's the name of the meeting now, which is Snow Camp. And actually they were working together. And with free Black people in those communities, extending, in fact, into Orange County, but we don't have time to go that far today. But there were these networks based on relationships, marriage, and business relationships in this county, which meant that many of the laws against free Black people living in North Carolina were basically ignored in this county. That had to be reality. And one of the things I wanted to bring up to our listeners is that this one thing used to really annoy me when I was teaching, was that my students had picked up the habit from, and I understand why, of calling free Black people free slaves, indicating that their status was basically no different from that of the enslaved. But this was really not true. It varied from place to place, but certainly in Guilford County, they were a small number of people, but a significant number. And they operated with fairly, I would say, ease of movement. They could move from place to place, they could own property, they were respected, and the law respected them. So that if you posed as a free Black person, it was definitely a threat to the slave system. And that's one of the reasons why the laws were so harsh, but they were not enforced as much because of the community here being different from communities elsewhere. I'll put it that way. The community standards, there's been some very important studies now coming out about the significance and the role of free Black people who lived through slavery era and stayed in this area and continue to participate in anti-slavery activity. I'll extend that to the Mendenhalls. The Mendenhall plantation, which I know is a controversial place because the Mendenhalls were Quakers and they were also slave owners. Technically, they were the largest slave owners in Guilford County, number-wise, because all the people who worked for them, they were legally enslaved. Mendenhall said that he'd done this because he was protecting them and preparing them for freedom, because many of them left and went to Indiana and Ohio and established themselves there because they had learned how to run his business, which he ran out of Mendenhall Plantation. I'm interested in that because at the same time, there's this false bottom wagon that the Jamestown Historical Society has preserved to show how people hid in those wagons. And there would be, on top there'd be corn or other produce. And in this tiny space, relatively speaking, they would hide up to 8 people. And they traveled those rocky roads up through the mountains to Virginia, through West Virginia now, Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio. And it's quite likely that they did. They had 2 teenage boys that drove the wagon. And they said they did that because they trusted the boys and they thought that they would be less suspicious on the road. And verifying those stories is one of my challenges, but I do think that it's quite likely that this did happen. And the roads today that we go up to Ohio on, like 52, were probably the roads that were used then in those times. And one of my main observations about the Underground Railroad, I think that we have overly dramatized, in some ways, the people who were going through the woods looking at the North Star. Now, this did happen, of course, but it's equally probably less likely that those who tried to escape north took the roads that everyone else took. They traveled by night and slept by day, and they disguised themselves, I said, in various ways so that they would not be easily identified as escaping from slavery. And they did what fugitives from the law will do today. That is, they did whatever was necessary to reach their goal. And I think my final comment is that we also have to take into account that Quakers had settled in North Carolina before the ones came here from Pennsylvania and Nantucket. In fact, I think the first governor of North Carolina, Archdale, was a Quaker. And in the 1600s, they established themselves in Eastern North Carolina. And the Eastern band, I'll call them the Quakers, were less sympathetic to anti-slavery persuasion. And many of them kept their slaves and continued to practice plantation agriculture with enslaved people, but others did not. Others were. There are counties in Eastern North Carolina, up in the northeastern section, where the Underground Railroad operated probably just as significantly as it did here in the Piedmont. So don't want to overstate the Piedmont connection and understate the Eastern connection, because Hiram Hilty, who was a groundbreaker faculty member in the chemistry department at Guilford, wrote a very interesting book called By Land and by Sea. And it's about Quakers who were involved in helping fugitives escape by sea. And once again, that's made possible because of the presence of a significant number of free Black people and enslaved Black people who worked the riverine systems in the eastern part of the state as oystermen, fishermen, and also they were, of course, many Black sailors on ships and sea captains that helped. So just to balance out our discussion, I think it's important to realize that the Underground Railroad existed all through North Carolina. And I think it's most exciting to make these Southern connections with Northern abolitionists so that we understand that there are many facets to our society. Even if it's a slave-owning state, it doesn't mean that all the people in that state support slavery or that none of them continue. They did continue to struggle against slavery, even up and through the Civil War. So I want to, I have a lot more I could say, but I want to give over now to our questions so that people who are on with us can have a chance to get their questions answered.
I want to follow up just very briefly before we hit, I see that we already have some questions. One is, if some of you football fans remember the wonderful football player, graduate of University of Illinois and later Pittsburgh Steelers running back, Rashad Mendenhall, was a descendant of those Mendenhalls who were taken north to Indiana and Illinois. And I also want to mention the name of John Armfield. As Adrian said, Quakers were very involved in slavery in North Carolina up to and beyond 1778. And one of the families, the Armfields, and there's still Armfields about, left Friends. It's not clear whether they left because they participated in the Revolutionary War in 1781 or because they were unwilling to give up their economic advantage with slavery. But they left Friends, and John Armfield from Guilford County went on to be the largest slave trader in American history. So it is an interesting mixed story, but on to the questions.
Oh, sorry, Max, since you opened the door, I'm sorry. One more thing, I did forget to add that the Methodists were also a significant factor in abolitionism in the Piedmont, especially the Wesleyan Methodists. And the Mendenhalls, the enslaved people who were Mendenhalls, are on the rolls at the Market Street Methodist Church. I believe it's one of the oldest churches in our region. And they opened up their records to me, and I have a list of the people who were enslaved, and they were named Mendenhall, who were members of the church. They had free Black people and enslaved Black people on their rolls beginning in the 1830s. And I do think that they must have been connected in some significant way with anti-slavery. So I wanted to just open up that we're not just talking about Quakers, also Methodists, Moravians, some Presbyterians, and even some Baptists might have been part of this.
Good. I saw one of the first questions was about the Underground Railroad tree in the Guilford College woods. I just wanted to briefly answer that question before getting to the others. The tulip poplar back in the woods is about a 350-year-old specimen, the second largest tulip poplar tree in North Carolina. The oldest, biggest one actually is in Perquimans County, there where Quakers first settled in North Carolina. And it's called the Underground Railroad tree because it's in that section of primitive forest that is described in Levi Coffin's Reminiscences, his autobiography, as the sanctuary for fugitives from slavery that he found when he was out feeding the woods where Edie and her infant child hid out. So that tree, although it was not a marker on the Underground Railroad, was a silent witness to the events described in those early Quaker journals of fugitives from slavery hiding out in the New Garden Woods, now part of the Guilford College campus.
Okay, well, and the next question is, how did Guilford County lawyer Elijah Mendenhall's strategy evolve in the cases between 1825 and 1845? In 1829, he lost a case in Randolph County in which 37 enslaved on the Thomas Little estate was sold.
Adrian, do you know anything about that?
Okay, no, I have been trying with some major difficulty to get access to court cases involving slavery in Guilford County. So I can't directly comment on that particular case or on Mendenhall's record, but that's an excellent question. Hopefully with future research, we'll be able to uncover more about that.
And was there any Underground Railroad activity in Western North Carolina? And if so, where can the person find information?
That's another good question. There have been some studies on slavery and anti-slavery activity in Western North Carolina going through the mountains. And I think there are some primary and mostly secondary sources that are available. I'd have to go into my library or go into my bibliography to be more specific. I will try to do that.
One thing
But there is, the simple answer is yes, there is good evidence that there were anti-slavery persons in Western North Carolina who helped people escape.
I'll just mention, although it's not directly related to the Underground Railroad, already by the 1790s, Quakers from New Garden Meeting had gone across the mountains of western North Carolina into Tennessee because it was an area where there was more anti-slavery activity, and settled the town of Friendsville, which is still in existence there south of Chattanooga.
Well, Max, will let you answer a real quick, easy question. What's the name of your book?
Oh, Tales from the New Garden Friends Graveyard. It's available at Scuppernong. Okay.
And do either one of you have more information about John Stanley's adopted son, Andrew Caldwell Morrow? He is my third great-grandfather. She's seen the wagon he traveled on, and it was incredibly moving.
No, you know, I spoke to the Stanley family reunion a couple years ago, and no one asked me that question. I wish they had. I would have probably dug into it. I have to go into the Stanley genealogy, probably through the census records and whatever we have at the library right now. But no, I know they've said that false bottom wagon that's at the Mendenhall plantation now was actually owned by Joshua Stanley. And I'm sure that was, that is a deep feeling to have that connection with an ancestor. Wish I could tell you more, but I can't.
Okay, John Winthrop is quoted from President Reagan to President Obama. America being a shining city on a hill. Yet I've read he was brutal towards Quakers. Is that true? And if so, was there any anti-slavery stance the reason for his brutality?
Who was that was brutal towards Quakers?
Yes, John Winthrop.
Yeah. Quakers were not overly popular in Massachusetts Bay Colony for several reasons. One was they didn't recognize the efficacy of the rites and rituals of the established church. They had a different interpretation of scripture than the Puritans. For example, they didn't believe in a predestination. They believed in free will. They also wouldn't pay their church tithes. They wouldn't serve in the militia. The Puritans were interested in getting rid of the Native Americans in Massachusetts, and you didn't want a whole bunch of pacifist Quakers in your colony if you're trying to get rid of the Native Americans. So it was actually a capital offense in Massachusetts until 1660 to be caught the third time as a Quaker. The Quakers don't hold grudges, but we can still name the four they hanged on Boston Common: William Robinson, William Ledra, Marmaduke Stevenson, and Mary Dyer. After Charles II prohibited capital punishment for Quakers in 1660, they just continued to flog Quakers. They would strip them naked, tie them to the back of ox carts, and whip them from town to town. That's why the first Quakers wound up in North Carolina. The Phillips family fled New England in 1665 and settled in the Great Dismal Swamp, so no one could find them in Perquimans County.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting to me as you think about it, that at the same time, Charles II appointed Archdale, who was a Quaker, to be the first governor of North Carolina. So I think that it's an interesting history of our country between harsh brutality and suppression on one hand, and recognition of our diversity on the other, and figuring out a way to allow, I guess, some Quakers who went along with the program, like Archdale, to really have major influence on the state. Very interesting.
How popular was the route to Indiana?
Very, I can say.
Relatives in that area.
Very popular. I know Max is from Indiana, so I'm sure he knows much more about than I do. I'm from Ohio. So the Underground Railroad went through my hometown in northeastern Ohio. And I know that material a little better on a firsthand account. But Max, I didn't mean to cut you off, but obviously there's a significant Quaker presence both in southern Ohio and in southern Indiana.
Yeah, the route essentially, as Adrian said earlier, is basically 52 up over Mount Airy, over the Blue Ridge through southern Virginia to Charleston, along the Kanawha River down to the Ohio River, and then along the Ohio, usually to old Lusantville, now Cincinnati. And from there, there were different routes up through Western Ohio and through Indiana to Canada. You had to get to Canada because the fugitive slave law allowed slave chasers to pursue folk into even free states. I grew up on one of the 4 routes through Indiana where the Underground Railroad operated. And there were free Black communities all through there as well, of people who settled and were protected by either the Quaker community or the strength of the free Black community, even before they got to Canada.
And Gallipolis, when you go over into Ohio, one of the bridges takes you through Gallipolis, which goes into, they call it Gallipolis, I believe.
Gallipolis.
Gallipolis, that's funny. But anyway, it's from that same route. So they branched through Indiana, and that's true. Nevertheless, many Black people did stay in Ohio and in Indiana, even though they were in peril being recaptured or retaken. But those communities are still there. And my family's from one of them, New Philadelphia, Ohio.
This person wants to know the mix of the underground mix in with the Indians of the Grandfather Mountain area.
I know Grandfather Mountain area, but I don't know that history.
The best person to answer that would be Arwen Smallwood at North Carolina A&T State University. He's the head of the History and Political Science Department, and he has done significant research on Native Americans, Quakers, and Blacks on the Underground Railroad. So I would defer to Arwen.
Right.
What are some of the local Underground Railroad markers?
Well, in addition to the tree, which is symbolic, and the Mendenhall plantation, I think there's some speculation about different houses, but I don't recommend right now being too definite yet about them. I think there are some homes, Max, aren't there, where people think because the people were abolitionists, they could possibly have been held there, especially in High Point.
Yeah, part of the interest in preserving the Elihu Mendenhall house there west of Deep River is a supposition that it might have been involved as well in Underground Railroad activity. It certainly was involved in Quaker efforts to educate those who were emancipated after the Civil War. So it has connections, whether it can be verified it was a site on the Underground Railroad. Around here, Adrian has said, it was more communities that took in fugitives. It wasn't tunnels and secret compartments and things like that. But there is that false bottom wagon, which is a good marker. I do want to take the opportunity to tell a story. It could be apocryphal, but there's the story of Levi Coffin, at the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum and home place up in Fountain City, Indiana. There's another false bottom wagon that they used. The story goes that Levi was transporting 2 guests, passengers on the Underground Railroad in that false bottom wagon once, back in the 1800s, and was transporting some clay pots, fortunately, in the cargo bay. And a slave chaser stopped him, and not having the papers to search the wagon, figured a Quaker would have to be honest. Quakers have to tell the truth. So he said, "Okay, Coffin, what are you really carrying in the bottom of that wagon? I know what you're up to." And Coffin's response, looking back at the pots and not wanting to betray his passengers, said, "Earthen vessels. I'm just carrying earthen vessels," which we are, but so are clay pots. I don't know if that's true, but it's a great example of some of the subterfuge that people had to use on the Underground Railroad.
And I think it's also, please, if you don't mind me saying this to our audience, I think we have a hard time today really coming to grips with how harsh the penalties were for harboring fugitive slaves. they were brutally harsh. People could lose everything they owned and maybe even their lives. Certainly prison sentences were imposed on whites who participated in this endeavor. They lost their land, they lost their property, they were flogged, there were court records of people being pilloried out in Greensboro in front of our courthouse, put on stocks, beaten, whipped 39 lashes. And the law provided that if a fugitive slave resisted, they could be killed on the spot for no justification, just for resisting, shot and killed right there. And I have several ads that verify that this was actually said by the people pursuing them. If they resist, man or woman, kill them, I don't care. I don't care how you do it or why. And there were no penalties against this. You see, we have to remember that enslaved people were not considered human beings in the sense that we look at human beings today as being sacred, having human rights. That was a part of the story. Maybe our culture hasn't evolved to the extent that we wanted to, but certainly have to remember 150 years ago, these Quakers were considered monsters by many other people in this community. They were repudiated. And in fact, they went so far in 1843 that the Friends, what do you call the whole General Assembly, Max? You know, with
the yearly meeting.
Yeah, the yearly meeting issued a statement that we do not support harboring fugitives. The yearly meeting made it clear, they issued this to the community, they wanted it posted in the newspapers, that we do not support this. This is illegal. In fact, in Indiana, the Quakers split over this issue. The abolitionist Quakers in Indiana split and said, no, the Underground Railroad that we have kind of romanticized today, if I may say, was so unpopular and marginal and marginalized in the past. To me, it's a miracle that we have the records that we have. And so I'm discouraging people from claiming that this house or that house was used, because in the first place, it's unlikely that we can verify it because the people had to be so careful about what they documented.
I want to affirm that because, again, Quaker involvement's over-romanticized as well. The minority of Quakers were abolitionists. They were all anti-slavery beginning in 1778. You couldn't remain Quaker and be involved in slavery officially, but they split over whether slavery should be ended through abolition or gradually. The majority of Quakers at that time were still in the world, but not of it. So they were opposed to Quakers mixing with the world's people. That explains why so many Quakers were read out of a meeting for marrying Methodists and Baptists. But it was also opposed to joining anti-slavery societies because they would be mixing with those Congregationalists and Unitarians and Free Methodists and others that Adrian has described as also involved in anti-slavery. So in my home community in Indiana, which was very proud of their Underground Railroad activity, you could be disowned as a Quaker into the Civil War period for either owning a slave or joining an anti-slavery society. The minority were like Levi Coffin and Hiram Mendenhall and Vestal Coffin, who were abolitionists and willing to work with others. The majority were gradualists. They believed that slavery would wither away in God's own time. And as Adrian said, in 1844, Indiana Yearly Meeting split over that issue. And there, for 17 years until the Civil War, was an Indiana Yearly Meeting and an Indiana Yearly Meeting of Anti-Slavery Friends, both opposed to slavery, but the larger body gradualists headed up by Elijah Coffin, Levi Coffin's first cousin, who was the clerk of Indiana Yearly Meeting, and both of whom had taught in that Negro school in 1821 at New Garden that against the law taught literacy to enslaved persons. But when they both migrated to Indiana, Elijah became a wealthy banker in Richmond and felt that abolition would destroy the economic system, kicked his first cousin out of the yearly meeting for his anti-slavery activity. So there you have it.
Okay, well, let's move on for a second. Someone else wants to know, were there any Quakers in the upcountry of South Carolina? If so, is there any evidence in their participation in the Underground Railroad?
Quakers were a large community in Bush River in there in South Carolina until about 1806, 1807, when the Quaker minister, traveling minister and prophet Zachariah Dix visited and had a prophecy that soon vines would be growing through the empty windows of their large meeting house because of slavery. And the whole lot of them packed up and moved as a community north. That's where you wound up with Bush Hill, renamed in the 1920s Archdale, after the Quaker governor. And many of them went on up to Ohio and Indiana. Same thing happened. There were Quakers in Wrightsboro, Georgia, starting in 1768 with a mass migration of Quakers because of the regulator movement out of Hillsboro down to McDuffie County, west of Augusta. Zachariah Dix visited them too, and they packed up around 1806, 1807 and moved to Ohio and Indiana. But that would be prior to Underground Railroad activity. So they may have harbored fugitives, may have given aid to fugitives, but again, we don't know of Underground Railroad activity until much later than that.
And you probably would look in the Charleston area because of it being such an active port city, although it imported a huge number of slaves, probably as many as New York or Philadelphia, if not more, or New Orleans, but it also was a route in the Underground Railroad by sea. So I would imagine if there were any friends in the Charleston, South Carolina area, that would be a ripe area to look for their participation.
Okay, what was the post-Civil War life like in Guilford County and North Carolina in general? How did life change for the inhabitants?
Talking about the emancipated folk?
That's all it said.
Okay. Well, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Aid Societies of Quakers up in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Indiana Yearly Meeting, and elsewhere sent teachers and others down to the South. There's a wonderful book by a former minister at High Point Friends, Linda Selleck, called Gentle Invaders, about predominantly female Quaker teachers who came south and set up schools. There was at one time an industrial school down in Asheboro that New York Quakers set up, and it eventually became the William Penn School, where John Coltrane attended in High Point. There's also Yardley Warner from Philadelphia who came down and bought land and made it available for the recently emancipated when other white landowners wouldn't sell land. And Harmon Unthank, an emancipated Black man, became the unofficial mayor of Warnersville. It became the first heritage community of Greensboro a few years ago. There was also the Woodies, John and Mary Woody, who were on the faculty at New Garden Boarding School and Guilford College, who bought land south of the railroad tracks in Greensboro, now Greensboro, West Market Street, 421, and made it available for emancipated Blacks, now known as Woodyside, where the great blues musician Logie Meacham grew up. So there was a good deal of that kind of activity.
The Terracotta community, yeah, which is off of now Windover Avenue, was a significant African-American community with a Quaker who ran the business there of making pipes.
Boren, yeah, Addison Boren's family.
Mm-hmm. And so Guilford College actually was surrounded by African-Americans on one side across Friendly Avenue now. It's been gentrified. So I would say, first of all, there was an upswing in communities and establishment of Black churches. Right as soon as emancipation went into effect in 1865, withdrawing from white churches where they were segregated and establishing their own churches and their own communities. A lot of political involvement, political activity up until the time that the federal troops were withdrawn from the state. And even still, North Carolina, African Americans persisted in participating in politics up and through the Wilmington Rebellion in 1898. So life changed, I would say, in North Carolina, tremendous ways, especially education, upswing in education for African Americans. This state has the largest numbers of historically Black colleges and universities in the country are in North Carolina. And there was a significant push for education, for industrial education, as well as liberal arts, creation of churches, communities, very lively period until federal troops were withdrawn and Reconstruction ended. And then segregation took an ugly turn, uglier than it was before. Violent turn.
Here's an interesting question, and probably don't have enough time to answer it, but there's several questions on this one. It says, who created the Underground Railroad? When was it created? And how did slavery begin? And who thought people needed to be enslaved?
Okay, good. Listen, the Underground Railroad as a term, it came about probably, one of the documents I found said 1830s. The first railroads started, steam-powered railroads in Columbia, Pennsylvania in 1831. And some slave owners said, I don't know what happened to my property. They disappeared, must be an underground railroad. So there was no real creation per se. No one declared this is the Underground Railroad. There's no date possible. But as Max has pointed out, I think it's 1819 when this network probably emerged that linked from between North and South to create what we now call the Underground Railroad. But slavery, now that goes back into ancient history. As for that question, that you have to go back into ancient world history, European, Asian, and African empires practiced enslavement. That's a huge subject, and the character of slavery in the past usually allowed people to win their freedom or only serve for a time, but it was not based on color or perpetual until it moved from the islands off of Europe, Eastern coast into North America. This was one of my topics in grad school, so don't get me started on that subject. That's a big subject, but it's embedded in the human experience, exploitation, forced labor, and it's embedded in the emergence of empires and kingdoms.
Was there any idea on how many enslaved people passed through the Piedmont on their way to freedom?
Well, John O. Franklin and Edith Brooks Higginbotham, their classic book, Slavery to Freedom, they use an estimate by a slave owner who said there were 100,000 people were lost from the economy by the Underground Railroad out of 4 million enslaved people at the time the Civil War broke out. And some have said 40,000 went through to Indiana. Between Ohio and Indiana, Indiana probably wins. The number I've seen is 40,000. Now, that doesn't take into account probably that more escaped through the east. Okay, going through Pennsylvania and up into New York. So these are rough estimates. Max may know a different one. Now, I've just heard these rough estimates.
Yeah, it's hard to know because records weren't really kept. But again, there were several routes. As Adrian said, there were eastern routes. There were routes that went by the coast up through the Great Dismal Swamp. There are the Maroons who head out there. And then there were the different routes up through Ohio and Indiana. As I mentioned, there were 4 different routes through Indiana alone up to Canada. And on one of those routes, again, Levi and Catherine Coffin from Guilford County had their home, which became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. And by Levi Coffin's accounts, through that home alone, there between 2,000 and 3,000 enslaved persons went to their freedom. And he had direct connections here. So we can estimate at least 2,000 or 3,000.
Right. And then William Still, who was a Black man who was an abolitionist and a businessman in Philadelphia, estimated like 5,000 or so went through that route. And then don't forget those who went far west, as one of our callers asked. And one of my students did a paper extending the Underground Railroad through Iowa. But there's evidence of Underground Railroad activity through Iowa, of course, through Chicago, up into the north. And don't forget, many people escaped south into Mexico. And that was less documented and there's less been written about it, but that was also an escape possibility, going to Mexico or getting on ships and going to the Caribbean.
I saw a comment, someone asked if there's still, one can still follow the trail of the Underground Railroad. Early 1990s, a young man from the Quaker community here in Guilford County, Aaron Nagel, did research, figured out the route that Levi Coffin described and walked it from Guilford County up to Richmond, Indiana. And he said there were still large stretches that were still open land that matched the descriptions in the early Quaker journals. Others were developed interstates, things like that. But indeed, he found that it took him 6 weeks by foot, but large stretches were still recognizable.
With no more wolves and no more, we used to have wolves and bobcats and
yeah.
Okay,
and
well,
you can stop off at McDonald's to get a cup of coffee.
It's 11 o'clock and we still have lots of questions, but we can get to those. We'll do this. We'll answer all the questions through email from Max and Dr. Israel. So we will really appreciate your time and everything. But is there one last question I thought I would ask would be, there's so many people that have asked about resources where they can do their own research. Where do you offer them to start?
Friends of the library at Guilford College, that was where I would start with our collection there in Guilford College Library.
And some good books. One would be Stephen B. Weeks' Southern Quakers and Slavery, Hiram Hilty's By Land and by Sea, and Fergus Bordewich's book, Bound for Canaan,
right.
The Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America, which makes the very, very excellent point that we've alluded to, but haven't really said specifically. This was a massive interracial civil disobedience movement. The majority of folk, obviously, were people of color, African Americans who had a vested interest in freedom and cooperated with the minority of folk who were whites.
Thank you, Dr. Israel and Dr. Carter, for sharing your knowledge with us, and thank the audience for your interest and support. How Did We Get Here? Educational series was presented by the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. The High Point Historical Society collects, preserves, and showcases the history of Greater High Point to foster a shared appreciation of our community, reflected in the stories, events, and traditions of our past. We extend our invitation for you to join our organization. You can find membership information on the High Point Museum webpage, as well as information about upcoming programs. This program and other programs have been recorded, and the links you can find on the High Point Museum website or on their YouTube channel. Please stop by our museum and explore High Point's history. Again, we thank Dr. Israel and Dr. Carter, and thank all of you for joining us today. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, High Point Historical Society and Museum.
Yes, and how do will you email me the questions you want me to respond to?
We sure will.
All right, thank you. Thank you
Thank you all participants. Couldn't have done it without you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your patience. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.